on the program? Who's the first lecturer? Stephen Hand? Stephen.
Of course, all know what male arm, what both these things are. And throughout the whole period, there were a hell of a lot of different ways of coping with the fact that male wasn't a perfect defence, and it eventually culminated in suits of full plate. Before I really get on to transition armour, I'd like to talk a bit about lamellar and scale armour, which you probably know. These were both used as reinforcings on mail and as substitutes for mail, and they're really a sort of sideline on the proper armour, because they've sort of been around since way back and they haven't really changed. Lamellar is made of small plates laced together, and scales are small plates riveted or laced onto a leather backing, overlapping each other. They're not really true plate armour in the proper sense of the word, so that's all I'm going to say about them. But throughout the period I'm talking about, they were used quite a lot, especially by poorer people. The story of transition armour is really one of mail and plate and the interaction between the two mediums. And the first reference that I've been able to find of any plate armour used as a reinforcing on mail, except for helmets and such, was a reference to plates of worked iron used by King Richard I and William de Vaz in a combat dated about 1225. And here we come across one of the great problems, is that you see here my surcoat, and knights would always wear surcoats, and so anything which was worn between the mail and the surcoat, you've got overall chance of seeing what it really was. So nobody really knows what these plates of worked iron were, but some sort of precursor to a coat of plates, which I'll be mentioning later. Another early sort of reinforcement was the cuirass, which is a hardened leather breastplate, and similarly to scale and lamellar, courbelie, hardened leather, was used quite extensively throughout the transition period, mainly by people who weren't rich enough to afford plate steel. About 1250 you get the start of the continuous evolution of armour. At about 1250, the first thing you get are small pollines, being knee pieces, and they were just round, basically round plates, just beaten into a bit of a curve, and they were laced onto the mail chausses. I think I've got some slides over here, if you'll just bear with me a bit. Take this thing over here. Right.
Top panel, mate, second button on the left. Third. No, leave that one on. Next one.
Yeah, it's not quite good.
Sorry, horrible thing.
It's not quite good. That's a good one.
This one. The top, they're off.
Well, anyway, chausses, if you don't know.
Thank you.
Could you turn the light on the thing?
It's not plugged in down the bottom.
Yes, where is it plugged in?
Sorry?
Just a minute.
It's not.
hauberk mail which was used throughout. Before the transition period, that was your basic armour. It's got attachments on the end which are called mufflers, and it's a pretty decent sort of armour, but as most of you will know, having been belted with all manner of nasty objects, it's not proof. And yeah, one of the first things, they're pollanes, as you see on these. They're a late design of pollanes. They should be worn over shorts, but that's only a training shot. And that brings us on to another early feature. About the third quarter of the 13th century, we get the introduction of demi-greaves, greaves being shin armour, and demi-greaves being greaves which only cover the front. These were strapped on over shorts, which I think there you go. They're strapped on over shorts, and the thing you've got to bear in mind is that the knight was a cavalryman, and so in a lot of cases leg armour is a lot further ahead of arm armour, because of course he's on a horse and he's higher up, and so people will be going for the lower sections of him more often. So the leg armour came in a lot before the arm armour. And also during the third quarter of the 13th century, you were getting some form of reinforced surcoat. Now, plate gauntlets was another thing that came in fairly early, and these were made on the. Another thing I should have mentioned about the coat of plates was it's a cloth. It's got a cloth outer covering, and there's plates riveted on the inside. And you see this sort of construction of plates riveted on the inside of cloth or heavy canvas in a lot of different armours, and the early plate gauntlets were of this construction. And so again, because of the cloth covering, it's hard to actually see the arrangement of the plates, and it's only because with the coat of plates, because of a large excavation on the side of the battle of Bisbee in 1361, that we've got some 20 or so coats of plates. But I found references to the gorget as far back as 1300s. Gorget is of course neck armour, and the early gorgets were just basically a cylinder of steel which came up to about just below the nose, and they're very, very rare indeed, but they were around. So people I've seen have said gorgets are 15th, 16th century. They were a lot earlier, and it comes in quite early, but it didn't become widespread for a long time. It was closed greaves, which use there. They've got pollanes attached above, but you can see the basic design. They're two hinged plates, which they're hinged usually on the outside and buckled on the inside. And with armour like that, you can dispense with the mail shorts entirely. And any of you who have ever walked in mail shorts will realise why you want to get rid of mail shorts, is because they're brutes things to walk in. Another thing is the cuisse, which is the thigh armour. During about 1250 to 1300, the length of the mail hauberk became shorter, and so the thighs became exposed, and you began to see what thigh armour was like. The early thigh armour, the first quarter of the 14th century, was what was called gamboise cuisses, and there's some sort of padded protection on the thigh, and these evolved into what you see here attached to the shorts, which is called the cuisse of plates. It's plates riveted on the inside of a canvas, in that case, or heavy cloth. covering, and that's made of 3 plates. There's a plate around the front of the leg and two plates which buckle behind the leg, and that's a very efficient defence. And from about 1320 onwards, you occasionally see solid plate cuisses, but these are very rare up until about Cressy, 1346, when they start becoming quite common. Like so. The original sabaton was again of the coated plates construction, and it evolved by about 1320 into this sort of construction here, which is just overlapping plates, usually known as lames, which overlap downwards into a pointy toe. And the pointy toe probably wasn't necessary, but it was part of the civilian fashion. And in armour, you see civilian fashions coming out in all the armour. And that just strapped on. That's strapped on over my shorts. Later on, you get sabatons which completely enclose the foot. And the earliest I've seen, which probably isn't the earliest they were used, was a closed sabaton on the Black Prince at the Battle of Macquarie, which is 1356. But that sort of thing was in for quite some time as a reinforcement of the mail. Arm harness, that followed the same basic design as leg harness. Again, I had a slide of arm harness, but it's the gremlins have got it, covering the back of the upper arm to cover you against slashes, called the rear brace. And they had an elbow piece, which was just basically a cuff, which later developed sideways, which covered the elbow. And as time went on, these became attached so that they were just one piece and you'd strap the whole thing all together. And by the time of Cressy, you got another feature which was shoulder defences, known as the sporter, which is overlapping lames up onto the top of the shoulder, and they were usually attached to the rear brace. And by about 1325, you got your first van brace similar to the closed greaves, which is made of 2 pieces. And this was again usually hinged on the outside and buckled on the inside, so the buckles couldn't be cut in combat. And lost myself here. Features seen quite often ailets. Now, these are a thing only seen in the transition period, really, which were large rectangular things which stood up from the shoulders. And from finds of ailets, they seem to have been only a thing to display your heraldic device on, because they're made of parchment and soft leather. So they wouldn't have, not like the classic fin on later arms to stop side cuts at the head. They wouldn't have really served much purpose other than to show your heraldry. Of course, you all know that the guy in the great helm.
I've got 300
It's a great way to, if you're seeking anonymity in a fight, you wear a great helm, so you need some sort of heraldic device to show who you actually are. The coif on the hauberk, which is the balaclava style wood, was before the transition period usually attached to the hauberk itself, but during the transition period it became separate, and I think we might have that there is just a lower cannon of the van brace, the 2-piece van brace.
Right.
And there's a couple more shots of the same piece.
You can get all like this. Take them.
Oh, what's the evidence here for? I'm looking for That's the one. Yeah, as you see here, there's sort of a thing which comes out on the shoulders, and extended into this cape, which gave added protection to the shoulders and effective. Now I'm on my way to helmets there, I'm getting on the helmets. The helmets,
What's the name of the thing that hangs around the shoulders called?
the thing on the shoulders, it's commonly called the avatar, the camail of the boy. And you also get camails hanging off helmets. That, in fact, is the nemesis of my costume. The helmet I've got is a bit too small, so I improvised and put a camail on it, which I haven't seen anywhere, so don't take any notice of it. I'm going to replace it. Back to helmets.
There is a coif under that. Oh,
Yeah, all right. There's a coif under that one, but that's only a that's a lazy coif for somebody who doesn't want to extend it down. That's Richard over there. So
the one that makes people go coif, they're all even more lazy and get Stephen like this, which they just think it is.
Which is why I've got it receiving extremely slightly.
Yeah, all right.
Nice tunic, sir.
All right. Well, that's your basic. Before in the early transition period, that was your basic helmet, the great helm. And as you see, they're very square and blocky. And again,
It was only a prototype.
that's Miss Udimic over there. And you see that's fairly blocky. It's very, very square indeed. And during the early transition period, your helmets changed somewhat. And as this one, they became tapered a lot more, so that you had a lot more glancing surfaces. And especially in the next shot, you see it's very tapered up towards the crown, the top of the head.
It's really outside of Tasmanian forehead, but don't worry. Cro-Magnon.
I'll ignore that comment from that man with the sloping Tasmanian forehead because he's a Tasmanian too. But as you see, there's a lot more glancing surfaces on a helmet like that. And another thing, they began wearing secondary helmets underneath the main helmet, and these were known as bassinets. And later on, the bassinet became the main helm, and this was a pointy style helm, almost like a normal helm, but with a long back, with a back section which came down to cover the back of the neck. And they're the helms you see with the classic pig face visor, you know, the Woody Woodpecker style visors. And the bassinet came in about 1300. You start to see them come in, being worn by themselves. And they were originally worn without visors. There's a particularly nice little thing I read about how, obviously by a man who favoured his armour, about a certain knight he knew who preferred to fight with just his bassinet on and without his great helm, and went on about all the good things about it. And it ends up by mentioning how this particular chap lost his nose at a certain battle because he had a helm. So because of that sort of thing, people developed the visors, and the visors usually had a very pointy snout, which is a very, very efficient glancing surface. And this was usually in France and England. In Germany and Italy, they had a different system. They had a very large camo on the helmet. They used to attach camos hanging down from them, and they would have a nasal piece which would come up and hook up onto a hook on the top of the helmet. And this actually rested on the nose, so you can imagine the number of broken noses you get. And they eventually had made visors as well. But the German and Italian visors were completely different. English and French visors were usually hinged at each side, whereas the Germans particularly favoured a central hinge and made what's known as the clap visor. And that usually had, rather than the pointy section, it usually had just a rounded section on the front, which didn't give very good glancing surfaces, but it was much preferable to an open face or just a nasal. Also during the early transition period, you get, you see here, I'm wearing a long surcoat, and what's known as the cyclist coat developed, because this sort of gets in the way, and you even see one of the most, Sir John Chandos, one of the most famous English knights, wore a long surcoat and he tripped on it in a fight and got skewered through the face with a spear because of it. So the long surcoat was out of fashion, and you got a surcoat which was long at the back and which was shortened at the front, and usually had sort of wavy edge at the front, but it only came down to about there at the front, so you had no problems about tripping over or whatever. And with this happening, you can see a lot better the leg arm, which is probably, from our point of view, a good thing. It's probably good at this point to bring it all together. I've got a quote here from a book by Claude Blair, European Armour, which time and time again proves to be the only really good reference on armour of this period. And it's a quote about the arming of a fairly up-to-date knight, circa 1330. And so the knight, having donned a close-fitting shirt, short breeches and hose, proceeded first to the arming of his legs with mail chausses, gamboise cuisses with polanes, greaves or demi-greaves, sabatons and spurs. After these he donned his acton, being his padded jacket, his hauberk or haubergeon being when they shortened the hauberk, and that became, the shortened hauberk became known as a haubergeon, which I think literally translates to little hauberk. And usually had the arm harness, and besagews I haven't mentioned. Besagews are a piece of armour which is basically a round section which hangs down in front of the shoulder, in front of the armpit, so you can't get skewered in the armpit. And a similar feature was known as the couter, which was a round plate covering the front of the elbow, and this later became attached to the coudiere, the elbow piece, and became just a side width. The arm harness and besagews attached to the hauberk sleeves. Let them put on his coat of plates. Sometimes the coat of plates and lower cannons of the arm harness were put on before the hauberk. The reverse arrangement seems to have been more usual. A surcoat or gambeson being another form of padded jacket, usually worn over the mail. A surcoat or gambeson was then put on over everything, followed by a narrow waist belt and the sword belt, which usually hung fairly slackly around the hips. Finally, but probably not until action was imminent, the gauntlets and the bassinet with its camo were put on. If the bassinet was visorless, it was usually supplemented by a helm with a crest. Our knight might also have worn alettes, a plate bevel and a pisane, which is a section of mail with thickened rings, so it's almost rigid, and it's a standing collar to protect the neck, of course. Might also have worn a pisane, although with the exception of the last name, the pisane, they were fairly uncommon at this date. And the surcoat referred to at this date might have been a long surcoat or a cyclist coat. During about the time at the start of the 100 Years' War, about 1340, you began to get the coat plate style gauntlet began to go out of fashion. In fact, it had gone out of fashion, and it was replaced by what's known as the hourglass gauntlet, which is a gauntlet which is pinched in very heavily at the wrist and flares out into a cuff, usually a fairly short cuff. And these, the first ones of these had mailed fingers and just had a plate. The plate just to the fingers. But by the time of the Battle of Cressy, they had, you see a lot of them with overlapping little sections of plate out on the fingers. And another nice little feature was gadlings. Gadlings are upraised spikes, although they could be another other sort of designs, like the Black Prince had his heraldic lion device as gadlings. And their basic idea was, if you got disarmed, you stuck your gadlings to the other guy's visor, and you get later gauntlets have really vicious long spikes coming off them, which you can stick through people's visors. Only as a stopgap measure, but could be quite effective. From about 1340 onwards, you get some coats of plates where all the front plates join together into a solid breastplate, and at this stage it's still covered by a canvas coat, but what's underneath is just one solid piece. And the breastplate also by about 1370 becomes separate from the rest of the coat of plates. You get some strange things where you get a solid breastplate but no back plate, and you just get the overlapping plates going round to the back like in the earlier coat of plates. But by about 1370, in fact, the earliest reference is 1374 that I could find, of a solid breastplate uncovered by any, with no cloth covering. And at this point I should say the armour which was uncovered was usually known as all white armour. And from about 1370 onwards it becomes increasingly more prevalent. You're probably familiar with the hauberk harness, which shows another form of early breastplate, which this has got a small globose breastplate which is made up of 9 pieces, a big central piece and 4 pieces on either side of that overlapping out, and it only comes round to about there. It laces and straps on over the mail, but for where it's covering down to about the diaphragm, it's good defence. And that's dated about 1390, but it's probably a fairly out-of-date feature at that stage. By about 1410, you get the first back plate coming in, and here you've got the full cuirass, which hinges out, goes around the body and straps on one side. Usually straps on the right side, I think, because the left side, of course, is facing the blade, so the straps are on the left side and be in danger of being cut. I've already mentioned fully enclosed sabatons, haven't I? They came in first about 1330 and remained unchanged, covering the entire foot. About 1340, you get your pollains, the knee pieces. Get there. Oh, there you go. They sort of narrow a bit. You see, the earlier ones were very, very wide around the sides of the knee. They sort of narrow, and they develop the 2 lanes, one above and below the knee. And they're originally strapped on over the plate, but as you see there, you've got a whopping great gap there. If I was in a show, I'd be wearing my male shorts underneath, so there'd be no real problem. You'd have to duck right in low to get in under, but it's still not very aesthetic. So I've attached my pollains to my greaves, which well, it's interesting in that it shows that I'm following, for my own reasons, exactly the same path that the armourers would have followed. They probably looked at the same thing and said, geez, that's an horrible great hole, let's do something to get rid of it. And so they attached the pollaines to the greaves, and when plate pieces came in, like that horrible thing there, which is my training piece, when they came in as hinged, as a two-plate hinged thing, they were also attached to the upper plate of the pollaine, and it went into one solid plate thing that could be put on all at once. And there's nothing worse when you're trying to arm up than to have dozens of little fiddly bits of armour to put on here and there. And one thing is you go and you mislay individual little bits of armour. I might just mention about the method of attaching camars on the helmets. There was an interesting method known as the vervels, and these are small staple almost things that which little sections which sort of curve out inwards and outwards from they're little small sections which you can pass a wire through, so you can pass a wire right around the inside rim of the helmet and attach the links onto this wire, and you can take it out quite easily and take the camar off and go off and clean the helmet, clean out the inside, which would be difficult with the camar on. And this was a really efficient way because it took a fair bit of time to make, but once it was made you could take the camar on, put it on, take it off really easily. Another point, about 1410 or so, your laminated spoiler up on the shoulder with besagew hanging on right down the front of the armpit, that changed into a single piece shoulder piece which was known as the pauldron, and this stayed in for the next 100, 200 years, and was occasionally made 2 or 3 pieces hinging, but that was pretty much a universal sort of piece of armour for the next several hundred years. And another point, the bassinet during the later transition period, it originally had breathe holes down the sides of the pig face or in front of the clap liner. But on later pig face bassinets, you noticed that there are only the holes down the right hand side, and the only logical explanation for this is that is that your left hand side is facing the other guy's lance, and if you've got any sort of hole, you've got some sort of purchase where the lance can push through into the face, and so in battle. Yeah, in battle, these sort of helmets were worn, but in the tournament, the great helm was still worn, and this changed and turned into what's known as the frog-mouthed helm, which had a great big lip coming forward and just a single vision thing on the dome top. And so from about 1330, 1340, you very rarely see great helms on the battlefield. And finally, with the advent of plate armour, you lost a lot of, your mail gradually diminished below the plate armour as the plate became more all-encompassing. And what you ended up with was that you needed a section of mail there to cover the inside of your elbow, and you needed a section of mail there and behind the joints basically. And so what they did was they had the arming doublet, which was a full body sort of padded jacket, which had little lappets of mail sewn onto the various areas where they were needed. And so that even if you had a vulnerable spot, you still had a little mail behind it, and you didn't have to wear a full suit underneath, which during the transition period you get large amounts of your armour consisted of a full 13th century mail suit covered by pretty much a full plate suit, and that's what my 1340 stuff consists of that. And they can tell it's coming. I'm going to go on about the weight now. That weighs about 110 pounds, which is too heavy. And so you're pretty much wearing one suit of armour over the other one. Whereas before the period you had mail, and that was lighter than transition armour. After the transition period you had plate, and that again was lighter because there was no mail underneath it. And at this point I reckon I bullshit it on.
You've seen it back in later, have you?
Yeah, that's
the whole thing.
That's the sort of dress gear. That's Brian and Richard up there. That's when I think some of you might have seen the work filmed by Nationwide. Absolute abortion, I think it was too. They are only interested in the fighting, but
Makes you see sometimes in underwear.
You're not.
But anyway, that's a couple of the heraldry. Mr. Dimmick up there is probably in a lot of trouble because he's using his the Dimmick coat of arms, quartered with the King's champion. Because the Dimmicks were, of course, the King's champions.
Everyone.
Everyone knows that. If you don't know Dimmick's King's champion, shame on you.
At least I know what a besagew is now.
That's Brian in all his clobber. Spanking new stuff, shield that had never been hit. That's Richard with his shield that had been hit. And that's with my shield that was replaced 2 or 3 days later, I think, or something like that. Me again. And me again. And that's my new shield. Laminated metal and wood shield. I'm not too sure about the authenticity of the metal, but my oath, it stands up to the blows a lot better.
Can we not go to today?
It's not here. You try bringing all your armour up on the plane. We just wear it. Yeah, I will. That's all the stuff at my place.
Next slide.
And that's all my personal stuff. And that's my place up. And that's the kids from over the road.
Dehydrated Tasmanian. That's one of Dave Saunders' little Vikings.
That's Tom, our mascot. And that's the tin can.
You didn't go to that party down the road last night, did you?
I'll tell you what, you need the armour to keep it out. I think that's about it.